Good morning. I'm Saini at the University of Canberra. I'm speaking with Michelle Grattan in our weekly conversation about politics in Australia. Good morning, Michelle.
Hi, Deep.
Michelle, let's talk about Scott Morrison's week in the United States. He had a pretty good week. He had a state dinner thrown in his honor by Donald Trump, and then he got to speak at the United Nations General Assembly. What are your overall impressions about this particular trip to US?
I think the trip will be rated a success. Certainly it reinforced the alliance connections and the fact that America values Australia very highly as an ally, but also the personal connection that Scott Morrison has with the President. Now, very controversial president, and some would say, well, a personal connection's got some downsides, but it does give Australia a good deal of access. However, I do think that there was a sort of tipping point when the two appeared at an opening of billionaire Anthony Pratt's paper factory in Ohio, and although the Australians didn't particularly want this, the effect of the appearance was that Scott Morrison looked to be at a Trump rally. President Trump had turned this opening, which would normally be a sort of ribbon-cutting ceremony, into a mini election rally, and I think that was not a good look for Scott Morrison. Including at home, not a good look, or particularly at home, because of course the President is not all that popular in Australia. Only about a quarter of people, for example, in the recent Lowy survey, thought that President Trump would do good things for the world.
And then there was the climate change summit. Scott Morrison didn't come to the summit, even though Donald Trump actually showed up for a short while.
Briefly.
Yeah, briefly. And that created a bit of a controversy. Then he, of course, made a statement that Australia is doing its bit on climate change, and there are people who would disagree with that, and they did. And so what are your thoughts on that particular performance of Morrison?
The government excused the absence of Scott Morrison by saying, well, only countries that were announcing new commitments got speaking roles. However, I don't think that was at all an adequate excuse. I think he should have gone to that summit. He looked to be deliberately avoiding it. He was deliberately avoiding it by making a speech in Chicago. So he was getting right away from New York, so he didn't have to go. As for the UN speech, I did think it was a very defensive speech. It was devoted virtually entirely to environmental issues. It stressed the preoccupation of the Prime Minister with trying to get action against plastics, plastic waste, recycling measures and measures to clean up the oceans. All very well, but nevertheless it did not properly or does not properly address the climate change crisis. And when Scott Morrison did talk about that, it was in a way to be on the defensive, to say Australia is doing its bit and nobody should challenge that. Well, lots of people are saying we're not doing enough.
And then there was Scott Morrison's call to China to take responsibility as a developed nation, and that is at a time when there is this trade war going on between United States and China. And do you think with that statement Scott Morrison came across as taking sides and taking sides with the United States?
He has said these things before. He said it particularly in a major speech in June, or at least he almost said it. He went a little bit further this time, he elaborated, but it was all context. He was in the United States. President Trump was making very strong anti-China statements. So Scott Morrison's position that China is a developed country and therefore should take up more responsibilities in terms of trade, the way it behaves in trade, and also on the environment, really got amplified, those comments. I think it's always been quite clear that Australia is taking the United States side in this trade war. What it disagrees with is the methods that President Trump is using, not the points that he's making about China needing to alter its behaviour. But certainly the message became louder and clearer by Scott Morrison's comments in the US.
Let's finish by coming back home here to ACT, where our government has passed legislation to legalize personal use of marijuana. This is the first jurisdiction in Australia to do so, and the federal government is talking about potentially challenging that and interfering in that. How justified would federal government be to do that, and is it really even necessary?
I think that there is some confusion and contradiction between the territory law and the federal law now that this situation has been changed in the ACT. So there would be an argument for clarifying that, for ironing that out. But of course then there's the wider point that the federal government has a quite different view on the substance of this issue from the ACT government. And I think that if the federal government does try to interfere, to essentially wipe this new move out, that will just open up a big argument about territory rights and would probably be a quite distracting argument for the Morrison government. So I think it would need to think very hard before it did try to say, well, we're going to impose our position on the territory. But that's probably separate from this question of whether the law has now become very confusing from the point of view of ordinary people in the territory.
Yeah. How likely do you think it is that federal government would interfere?
Look, I think it's too early to say. There have been conflicting messages over the last few days from various people in the federal government. I think they haven't yet got their heads around the practicality and the politics of interfering. They're just striking poses at the moment.
Thank you, Michelle, and you have a nice weekend, and we'll talk again next Friday.
Thanks, Steve.